well, who's the real you? You know, we want to know you. The sociocultural person says, once you start digging through all this, you may get to the center and find maybe a very small part that maybe doesn't have much of anything. But that you yourself is a set of rules that you enact into the world. So it's not a very happy theory of people. You know, Foucault and others would carry this to the point where they would say that humans don't exist. The only thing that exists are nodes of linguistic activity, nodes of discourse. So all we are here, there are no selves here. There are just people who are enacting a language game, a discourse, that has given us a role to play, language to use, and we think ourselves successful when we do that well. So it's, yeah. So there, I mean, it's a very, you can push this to a very far extent. And, you know, I don't know that, depending on your commitments of belief in other things, you may, you know, go that way or you may not go that way. I think it's kind of a depressing way to go. I happen to like to think that I exist. I don't know, it makes me feel good. So it is interesting. Let's make sure we get this straight. We go across to his. It's plausible when it appeals to things like this. So these are things that most people would say, yeah, society affects us, we are a product of the world we live in. He says it's interesting when it challenges things like this. So the last column is the challenge column. So it challenges individual agency and responsibility. So how does a sociocultural view challenge the idea of individual agency and responsibility?
Because then you can say, like, it's not you, it's because of your social influence in the environment, like we're kind of thought.
Yeah, if there's very little real self, then what the explanation for your behaviors is largely cultural.
Just like TV, like kids
social.
Violence, they're like,
right.
Oh, you know, and they're like, oh, they saw it on TV, and it like takes it the blame away from them.
Yes.
Puts it on.
So cultural, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Media theories that you know, if your act of violence was a result of your social conditioning or the culture you're in or whatever, then how can we hold you individually responsible for it? So it becomes a problem.
Well, when you use the word, it was a few weeks ago, forgive me for being vague, but when you use the word, when you're an effect of something.
You're an effect, right? You're historically effected consciousness.
So is that sort of this? You're a
culturally affected being, yeah. Which makes it very hard to hold individuals responsible for their behaviors. Right. Okay.
Okay, I was going to say, does this pair with, would a rhetorician use some of these things also? To kind of talk their way out of, I mean, I guess I'm pairing it with kind of like a lawyer, but, you know, to kind of talk their way out of a situation?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it would be in a rhetorical invention process, or what are the available means of argument available to my client. One of the things you could argue is that they are a product of their environment. Therefore, you have to hold the environment responsible, not them.
Because this could never end. at some point, right?
Right. Yeah.
There were some lawsuits that, like, I think one, like, wrestling, like, a little kid, like, either
Yeah, I know what you're
killed
talking
someone,
about.
like, he, like, jumped on, like, a kid that was, like, half his age and killed him, and they blamed it on, like, oh, he saw it on TV.
Yes, yes.
And, like, there were some other ones with, like, video games and stuff, too.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, this is a common view today, you know. I mean, we're living in a postmodern world that thinks a lot about culture rather than a world that thinks about individuals who have responsibilities, you know.
However, does the theory go so far as to rule out saying judgment or sanity?
Well, some do, some don't.
I mean, when talking about us being products of our society and of our culture, that is referring to the way we perform in our daily routines and rituals and the way we think and behave maybe, but going so far as to thinking of crime as a product of society and not of the person itself. I mean, that's pathological, not cultural.
Well, no, to be pathological, you have to be thinking psychologically.
Okay, not path. Yeah.
I mean, you could talk about a sociopath, maybe, I guess, but... Lori, what do you want to say?
I was going to say something along the lines of that, like people who are products of like KKK member families, or even you can look at the negative of, I don't know, the suicidal bombers and stuff like that. They look at this as a product of society, of that culture, of that.
Yeah.
Do they make excuses up, or
Yes, but that is
is
correct.
it? But that's limited.
Collective in that point. If it's individual, like an individual crime, that would be something else.
But they're like a cultural, like KKK is like a.
Yes, of course.
That's a culture.
Right.
Like,
That's an enactment in sociocultural, that the rituals, their performances, we do these things, we say these things together, we do these things together.
So then they would look at, like, even like kids, if they do something, they're a product of their culture.
Well, I'm not a judge, so I can't
Right, I
say, but...
understand. From that, I can't.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a world that was really wrapped up in a sociocultural model, there would be a lot more blaming of parents, society, the government for not providing funds to change the culture of this community.
Have you ever seen studies done the other way around, where it's not like, you know, someone who was brought up in a world of hatred and committed a hate crime, but someone who was brought up in a you know, an ideal setting, who then goes on I
to do a
don't know
thing.
how this guy was brought up, but there was some American
Right.
then joined Al Qaeda.
Right, right.
You know, some, and he may have been, you know, a little messed up to begin with, you know, but
We don't know, right?
right, but something like that. Just for argument's sake, somebody was brought up in a nice neighborhood or something.
Right. I don't know of any
Yeah.
studies like that. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about now is actually in the realm of criminal justice studies.
Well, if you do like a lot of things, like people who like join gangs or cults or like any kind of mass group like that, they usually like fit a typical like, you know, like
Profile.
like certain things like the need for inclusion and stuff like that. So it might fall into that, like he didn't have it. And that's why.
Well, but again, it matters where you're going to operate from. Now, I think, Laura, you know, your point about, well, let's be sane about this, you know, but the whole idea of what is sanity and what is rationality is in dispute in a postmodern setting. Alasdair MacIntyre, for instance, has written a book called Whose Justice? Which Rationality? In which he documents through history different conceptions of what justice is and different conceptions of what rationality are, and shows that these are historically defined and that those historical definitions have significance for courts and for organizations and governments. So there's a lot of writing about this. Whose Justice, Which Rationality is just one example of it. Richard Rorty has written Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which is the idea that we think some things are natural, but they're cultural, and how do we think about that in terms of people? Oh, Foucault, I remember what I was thinking about. Foucault. Foucault was fascinated with the idea that ideas have huge significance in the medical and judicial realm. You ran into the panopticon in this readings. You know, Foucault's view of the way people internalize their own discipline. That's his word, discipline. You know, that they internalize a structure of behaviors. Mead says this too, that people internalize the other. So the other doesn't have to be there for me to behave right, because I've internalized the other. And I bounce all my actions against this generalized other that's already existing inside of me now. It's become part of me. And me, part of the me. So Foucault was interested in the question of when did we stop beating prisoners and drawing and quartering them, and started to put them into rehabilitation programs, right? Instead of punishing the individual physically for their own behaviors, now all of a sudden we took a medical model or a cultural model of crime and began to say, okay, what you need is to be cured of your illness, or what you need is to be re-cultured so that you won't do these things. Whereas the old punishment system was to chop off your hand or hang you or put you in stocks and physically humiliate you. So Foucault looked at all that stuff and he said the change of all of these things is a linguistic change in how we describe ourselves and our cultures. So for Foucault, language has huge significance.
Wouldn't that, though, in terms of rehabilitation, be considered more socio-psychological, since that has to do more with the thought or the concept of being able to change one's mind?
Yes. Yeah. But the context in which it becomes socio-psychological is a socio-cultural context that changes the view, where we agree to think of it this way.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Okay.
that because
that it's an option for people to.
Yeah, to be remediated.
Not so much the rehabilitation, but it's possible, you know.
Right, because in the pre-one, you had traits. You were a pathological person. You were a criminal. You know, this is who you were. This was your absolute identity. Versus an unabsolute identity, which is a variable identity, a multiple identity, a changeable identity. So that's one of the things that sociocultural challenges that we think of normally, that you are who you are, you have a self, and that self acts into the world and is responsible for its actions. Sociocultural says there is no absolute self, you are a social self, and your agency is given to you by culture, and maybe the responsibility for some of your actions is culturally based. So it challenges, and the naturalness of the social order, which we talked about. Critical theory will talk about this as reification, the idea that the things that exist, the arrangements that exist, are natural, and that's how they should be, and that's how they are. instead of seeing that they are constructed and that we have constructed them, that they are human creations. So you can see how this fits right into a postmodern perspective, where we move away from grand narratives, meta-narratives, big explanations of what's going on in the world and life, and we break it down then into cultural explanations and local meanings to things, not grand meanings to things. Everything becomes local. Truth becomes localized. So we're okay. Any thoughts or questions? I'm just working through Craig's chart just to show you this is a useful chart we're going back to. You know, sometimes I've asked people and their comps for theory to take their favorite tradition and then go through it and bounce it off of some other way of thinking about public relations or whatever and make their own little Craig chart and then talk about it. I did that with one of the students. Well, sort of for Hall's theory of intercultural, and she'll be talking about that. So how does sociocultural interact with the other ones? So sociocultural, the rhetorician comes along and says, let's talk about practical questions and make up arguments and find the best way to persuade each other. And the sociocultural person comes along and says, well, you don't realize that what's a good argument one time may not be a good argument another time. You're culture bound. So Aristotle's arguments may not be good arguments today. So think about culture. And you're in this world where individuals, you know, have characteristics and traits and make arguments to other individuals. We're in a world where all of those individuals have been shaped by a common culture. The selves have been shaped by a common culture. So they are going to be, arguments and persuasion are already between people who are formed by similar backgrounds and language. So the social structure has shaped the people, not they're just individuals who need to be persuaded as an audience. I think about the whole culture. That's part of it. Again, a lot of these criticisms are the same way. The sign has its meaning. You're so focused on the sign, but you don't realize that the community creates the sign. So we should look at the way communities function around signs instead of the sign. Sign itself doesn't matter. What matters is what the community does with it. Yeah. So you want to dialogue and meet the other person in phenomenology, but that whole process is already determined by the culture and the language that's available and the way people think about the other. So there's no genuine meeting of authentic selves. There are social processes going on back and forth. Yeah. So a lot of these are the same kind of argument. Jeff?
It just strikes me, is it fair to say that, you know, when I think about semiotics and rhetorical theory, they seem to be about getting things done.
Semiotics and rhetorical theory.
You know, like, you know, here's the symbol we can put out there that's understood. Here's the argument that will work best. When you know, as we're discussing socioculture, what strikes me is it seems to be about identifying why things can't work or don't work, or it doesn't seem to be about, I would have a hard time, I could identify problems with it. It doesn't seem to be geared towards solving the problems, at least as, you know, as I was reading it seemed to be sort of about pointing things out that don't jive.
Well, it could be, that would be to say that it's a descriptive and an explanatory theory,
Right.
rather than a predictive or a transformative theory.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily true, because we'll look at speech act theory as very practical. And but I mean, it has a lot of, it's informed by a lot of sociology. I mean, in sociology, the key point of sociology is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That what society is not just the sum of its parts. That it is something else that then affects all the parts. So that's a key belief of this sociological perspective. Whereas a psychologist wants to say there are people, and people do things together, and you understand it in terms of their traits and attitudes.
Wouldn't that also apply to cybernetics?
That the whole is greater than the parts. Yes, that's true. A cybernetic view says that the individual is explained by the whole of which they are a part. Yeah, it's interesting to think, I've never thought about why it's not really a sociocultural, cybernetics is not really a sociocultural theory. Because we'll see that sociocultural theories really don't range so far. They stay fairly local in terms of things. Whereas your cybernetic keeps trying to ask the question of the whole. Maybe what I would be inclined to say is that sociocultural is a subcategory of cybernetic.
I don't know. To me, most of them, or major parts of several theories, overlap.
Yeah.
Like they have these useless discussions and contradictions. They could be talking and agreeing on the same thing. It's just that they choose to emphasize different parts of the same theory or the same process.
Yeah.
For instance, I mean, semiotics and sociocultural, debating on the sign. I mean, sociocultural say that semioticians focus too much on the symbol, but I guess they would both agree saying that symbols have different meanings within different contexts. Because it's a theory that applies to both, right?
Yeah.
But one of them chooses to focus on the symbol, whereas the other one chooses to focus on the
Context,
community.
right, the community,
And so
right.
which determines both? I mean, what's the chicken or the egg?
Well, I think they would say, in all fairness to them, that it does matter. Because, the semiotician wants to say the sign comes first and forms the community. The community is formed by its attachment to the sign.
To make my point, the way I was going is that it's very hard to choose from among the traditions.
Yeah,
Because
right.
most of them, and to me, all of them make sense. Like,
Well, sure. Well, there's 300 theories and 7 traditions. So, depends what you want to look at and what you want to do, with it.
Well, choosing then to limit your perspectives, right, and your perception.
Well, you limit it so that you can do something, so that you can focus on something. I use the toolbox metaphor. That, I have a wrench and a hammer and a saw and a screwdriver. And there are times when I can use a wrench as a hammer, but it's not the best hammer, and there are times when I can use a, plane as a level, but it's not the best one for it. So you choose the best tool for the right job. So like if we have an organizational or an interpersonal problem, that you're facing, then you ask, well, what's the best perspective for me to take? Like you ran into Montgomery and Baxter's relational dialectics in this reading, which is a nice theory of interpersonal relationships. It says that relationships instead of asking about the psychology of each individual person, let's talk about the movement of tensions between the people, between togetherness and apartness, between revealing and concealing. You know, let's talk about the way that all relationships are a constant movement of all of these things together. So it's highly complex and it's created together and it's affected by the larger culture. And so what our relationship is about is the movement of all these things and us learning how to negotiate together all of these different tensions. Instead of saying, well, okay, let's get it set and freeze it, you know, and then let's get the next one set. These are going to be constant motion. And so you become used to a relationship as a fluid thing that sometimes is closer, sometimes is farther apart, sometimes is revealing, sometimes is concealing, sometimes, you know, sometimes involves others, sometimes doesn't involve others, you know. So that's a nice theory. Yeah, and you know, I mean, if you have to have a multi-tool, you know, like one of those things you carry around in your belt, you know, your multi-tool, you know, right, a gadget thing. You know, I like to carry around coordinated management of meaning. You know, that works for me in a lot of different places, you know, so you pick your favorite multi-theory to work with. All right, let's take a little bit of time with speech act theory, then we'll break. We've already gone for an hour, and we'll talk about speech act theory. Now, this is on page 112 in your books if you want to follow it along, but I do want to take some time with this. Have you done speech act theory in other classes? Right. This is kind of, it feels at first like it's just so annoyingly picky. But it does become powerful, so hang in there a little bit. All right. Speech act theory says that words, when we deploy words, we intend to accomplish something. Just an insight, you know, that anytime we speak, there is an action. So speech is action. So it's not just words that you're saying. Speech is action. And so you have to look at a couple of different things that are going on when I speak. And so one of the ways I can talk about this is that and these are different kinds of acts I can do. So on the one hand, there is the utterance act, which is to say it. So I say something, someone points to me and says, you just did an utterance act. And I say, that's right. Then they say, you also did a propositional act. You made a statement about the condition of things in the world. So I not only uttered something, but I made a claim that this is the case. So for instance, if I say, it's raining outside, I've done at least two things so far. I've made an utterance, and I have stated a proposition that I believe to be true. Okay. Then, I've also made, in this language of analysis, an illocutionary act. Okay. Which is to say, I intended it to mean something to you. So if I say to you, it's raining outside, I think that's what I said, I've done an utterance act, I've made a propositional statement, but I've also made a illocution, a meaning act, which might be, I want you to give me a ride to the parking lot. That's the illocution of that propositional utterance, you know, just to push it really far, is I have a meaning that means to me. And a perlocutionary has to do with the idea that it's designed to have an actual effect on the other person's behavior. So on the one hand, I may wish that you would give me a ride, you know, or something like that. But if that's really what my intent is, that's different from the meaning of it. So if I, again, one of the examples from Pierce in Coordinated Management of Meaning is the "Are you hungry?" one. Remember we did that? Are you hungry? So a speech act theorist looks at that and says, all right, there are four things going on here. There is an utterance, there is a proposition being made, a statement of